Due to the emerging diversity in terms of people, in terms of identities, being more inclusive, the change, there's been a change in terms of how we operate, right? Not only for our clients, but also within clinical supervision as it all trickles down. And so we want to make sure that we are meeting the needs of those diversity of our clients as well as our supervisees who are seeing the clients. This isn't just a theoretical concept. It really is something that, this might be a big saying, but I'll say, and I guess I'll stand on this hill. But if you are not doing culturally relevant, and again, there are like a ton of different names, right? Like culturally responsive, I used here, but I've also used multicultural, um, cultural sensitivity. So all of those terms kind of mean the same thing, being sensitive to another culture that is different from yours, having an open mind to what someone else's culture is. And in most of our codes of ethics, this is equivalent to being ethical and having effective clinical practice. So I would encourage you, if anything, by the time you leave today, I would really consider maybe one or two, right? Because we can't do everything, but maybe one or two things, concepts that you want to leave with that you're going to start to implement a part of your clinical supervision practice or a part of your supervisee's practice for working with their clients. Um, Honestly, clinical, culturally relevant or responsive, that's another one. Culturally relevant is another term. Culturally responsive clinical supervision. It really focuses on acknowledging and addressing the influence of culture. We'll get into it a little bit more as we go through this today, but I'll say in general, to ignore culture within the clinical supervision model or the counseling model really is doing a huge disservice to the whole clinical supervision triad, so the supervisor, supervisee, and client. And it promotes these concepts of equity and social justice, right? So equity being um, different than equality, right? So equality is giving everyone the same thing, whereas equity is saying, hey, let me get to know you, let me understand what are, the different things that are going on for you, and based on your needs, let's provide you with that. And then social justice, focusing on what are the injustices that our clients or supervisees might be facing, and how does that show up in the clinical supervision space as well as the client space. Yeah, Andrew, for sure. So Andrew is saying he would be concerned with language that heals and language that harms. Absolutely. Language is a big piece of how we understand and acknowledge different parts of who we are, of how we move through the world. And so understanding what is more inclusive language versus harmful language as well. Okay, so these are some of the complications of being a clinical supervisor, right? So, at least when I was in the field, and I don't think it's been that long, but it's been a little bit longer since I've worked in like a OMHC or clinical mental health setting, right? So, at least from when I worked there, it was very, what's the word? Common. It would be common that someone who had tenure would, take the trainings and become a clinical supervisor. Or back in the day when I was in mental health, we didn't have clinical supervision training. So it was just assumed that they've been the most senior counselor, they are going to be a clinical supervisor. Unfortunately, as I think most of us may know, if you've not had the greatest experience with a clinical supervisor, just because you're a great clinician does not mean you're going to be a great supervisor, right? So making sure that supervisors are getting the correct training that they need in order to have culturally responsive clinical supervision. I've taken the training before. There are so many things outside of the training that also are included a part of this. And so, depending on which training you go to, it may or may not offer that cultural lens as well. And so, those may be spaces that you can challenge as well. The another complication is I'm gonna assume most people, but if you don't know, getting a license is actually like a big thing in terms of there are so many barriers that can prevent someone from getting a license in terms of financial means, in terms of like education about the license and the process. Because I know in my state, I can't speak for other states, it's not something that's like it's written down, but it's not very user friendly, I'll say. And maybe that was just me as I was going through the process, but it weeds out a lot of people, and who are typically left are who we might call weird. So Western educated, industrialized, rich, and from a democratic society, which means that we are leaving out a good chunk of people, right, within our society. So people of color, LGBT, part of the LGBT community. We might be leaving out people who are neurodivergent, and many other kind of people that might be left out. But looking at like face value without like fighting some of the injustices that are even around getting a license is also a complication that I think often we lean on and don't challenge enough. And then lastly, another complication is, so I identify as a counselor, and I understand that the social work field and substance counselors, they do a tremendous job of advocating and lobbying for different laws and legislations and really hitting into like that macro level that even the way I was trained, I'm trying to teach my students differently here, but that if you're not trained to look at things from a systematic perspective, and I usually think of like Bromfiner as one example, but there are many other kind of ways to look at that ecology of, we have this client that is here, and within the client, we've got the supervisor and the supervisee, right? But then how does the different systems that a client lives in impact the work that they're doing with you, right? So if they are facing homophobia at work, right? And we're talking, but we're not getting at, what are some of the other messages they may have received, like from society, from their community. They're part of a religious or spiritual part. Like we need to understand all of those systems of oppression in order to really conceptualize our clients. And so that's another complication. And so if you're learning that at the master's level, and you're not, as a supervisor, going out and doing more work around that, then that will still be the lens at which you are going to do clinical supervision. There also is a lot more research that's needed in terms of client and supervisee, as well as supervisee and supervisor research, like outcome research about, if we do this, then this works, which research, it's a little funky like that, but, having more outcome research so that we have a better idea of what are best practices also in terms of different modalities to use as well.